First of all, a very warm welcome to everyone to our Supporting a Loved One with Ovarian Cancer webinar. My name is Rachel Mugnai and I'm one of the nurse advisors here at Target Ovarian Cancer. So we're going to start off with a little bit of housekeeping. So in terms of what to expect from today is your chance to learn more about communicating with your loved one, about accessing and providing practical and emotional support, and also how to support your loved one with their physical and emotional recovery. It may be that not all the content that we cover during the webinar is relevant for you. So before we get started, here are a few final reminders. Don't forget everyone is at different stages and coping differently, so please keep this in mind and respect everyone's views and concerns if they comment on the video. We want to make sure that this session is a safe and positive space for everyone that takes part. Also, please remember that this session isn't a substitute for medical advice. Anything that comes out of this session isn't a substitute for the medical advice that you've been given by your loved one's clinical team. The idea of this session is to give you some extra ideas about how you can support your loved ones. Also, just to mention, if anything comes up today during the webinar that you're not sure about in terms of what it means for you or your loved one, or you have any other questions or concerns, then you can call our support line to get more information. If at any point you feel the need to take a break from the webinar, please feel free. So now we'll move on to starting the seminar. So why did we choose to present a seminar looking at supporting a loved one with ovarian cancer? Well, myself and Val, who's the other nurse advisor here at Target Ovarian Cancer, have a lot of clinical experience of caring for women and their families with ovarian cancer. And throughout that experience, we've gathered many themes about the common concerns that are experienced by a woman with a diagnosis of ovarian cancer. And quite often on our support line, we'll take calls or emails from a woman with ovarian cancer. And invariably, they more often than not mention that the diagnosis hasn't just had an impact on them, but it's had an impact on their loved ones as well. So we do know that we offer a lot of support to the women themselves with ovarian cancer, but we do know how difficult it can be to be the loved one of someone with ovarian cancer as well. So we wanted to try and provide some unique support to you, the loved ones as well. So we really do hope, therefore, that this webinar will provide useful information and advice for the loved ones of women with ovarian cancer. So I will be looking at the impact of a cancer diagnosis on an individual, how communication is so very important and how communication strategies can help you to make this process easier. I'll be looking at practical advice on supporting the woman with ovarian cancer with both the physical and the emotional consequences of that cancer. We'll then move on to look at the challenges of the phase of time, which is known as end of treatment, and how you can help support the woman during this quite often difficult time. And last but not least, we'll discuss the importance of looking after yourself as well. So this first slide is looking at the impact of a cancer diagnosis on the person who has that diagnosis. So within cancer nursing, we quite often talk about the holistic care of a person. So holism is about the whole being that embodies the physical, the emotional, the spiritual, and the social well-being that make up the person. And it's safe to say, as we can see from this slide, that the diagnosis of any cancer has a huge impact on each and every one of these areas of a person's life. So in terms of the physical effects, these are often the most visible and the most obvious effects to those people who are looking from the outside in. So you can have the physical effects of the cancer itself. That might be something like a swollen abdomen or some weight loss, but you can also have the physical effects of the cancer treatment itself. So for example, a woman might lose her hair when she's on chemotherapy, and that can be a very visible consequence of that cancer diagnosis. The emotional consequences of a diagnosis are absolutely enormous. Just hearing the word cancer can, really very much send the threat system of the brain into overdrive. So for a lot of women with ovarian cancer, fear and anxiety are extremely common, as are depression and low mood. Less commonly or more talked about is the fact that women can feel anger in terms of why me? Why have I got this diagnosis? And as a loved one of someone with ovarian cancer, it can often feel as though that anger is directed towards you. Now, this isn't because they are actually angry with you, it's because you're quite often their safe space. They feel able to vent and release. And quite often as well, the anger can actually cover other feelings such as sadness or fear or anxiety. Women often tell us that they feel guilty. This guilt's often quite misplaced. They'll say things like, well, have I got this cancer because I haven't looked after myself? They often feel a sense of guilt for putting their loved ones through the experience of their cancer diagnosis. In terms of the spiritual and social consequences, these are not always quite as easy to anticipate. So a cancer diagnosis can cause changes in someone's role and functions, both inside and outside the home. So women quite often tell us that, well, I'm the strong one in the family. I'm the person that people always come to for support and advice. And that role's completely changed because actually I'm now reliant on other people. The role can also change outside the household in terms of social and work spheres. And another thing that features quite heavily with a cancer diagnosis is around uncertainty about the future. Will this cancer come back? What will happen if this cancer comes back? Will I be around to see X happen, or I'll be around for Y to happen? And that can be very difficult for women as well. So moving on to the next slide, we're having a little game of spot the difference here, because actually this slide looks very similar to the previous one. So I'm hoping there's two small differences between these slides, and I'm hoping that the eagle-eyed amongst you have already picked them out. What I will say is that they are incredibly similar. This slide looks at the impact of a cancer diagnosis on family and friends, whereas the previous one was in relation to the person with cancer. And actually those experiences, other than the physical consequences, are actually very, very similar. So this experience will be very hard on you as the loved one as well. So if we go to the physical side of things, first of all, obviously you won't have the cancer symptoms or the treatment side effects, but actually a lot of loved ones of someone with an ovarian cancer diagnosis will tell us that they have quite a lot of fatigue or overwhelming tiredness, because caring for and worrying about a loved one with ovarian cancer can be mentally and physically exhausting. The chances are that you probably spend a lot of time thinking about the diagnosis. You may find that your sleep is also disturbed. It's also important to talk about the effects that chronic stress can have on the body. So whenever our body perceives a threat, like a loved one having ovarian cancer, what happens is that our threat system in our brain activates, and the brain instructs the adrenal gland to release the hormones cortisol and adrenaline. And the reason it does this is because these hormones prepare our body to either fight against the threat or flee away from the danger. So cortisol and adrenaline shut down or slow down some of the non-essential bodily functions, such as digestion, your immune responses, and the body's ability to repair and grow. So if we have constant stresses in our lives, for example, if we're worried about someone with ovarian cancer, we have to be really careful that that chronic stress response doesn't cause us to experience bodily symptoms. So this might be something like experiencing heartburn, nausea, indigestion. People can have really quite severe muscular aches and pains, headaches, they can't sleep, and they have memory issues. And we'll come back to talking about chronic stress later and the things that you can do to help try and protect yourself from these effects. In terms of your emotional response, the chances are you will probably feel some grief and some loss here as well. You may feel a sense of grief and loss for the life that you had before the cancer diagnosis. You may feel grief about losing that certainty about what your future will look like. And we also hear from a lot of people that they have almost an anticipatory sort of grief. They'll say, I feel petrified of losing her. Guilt can be common amongst loved ones as well. You may find it that you feel guilty about being well when someone who you really care about has cancer. You might feel guilty because you're actually finding it hard to cope. You might feel guilty because you're not able to dedicate as much time to other roles that you fulfill within your life, such as being a parent, a partner, or an employee. If you do feel these feelings of guilt, please don't bottle them up. Please do talk to someone that you trust about them, because they may just help you to feel differently about this guilt and see things differently. So moving on to the next slide, we're going to look at communication next. So I'm sure most of you are watching this evening or watching back the webinar because you want to hear some very practical suggestions about how you can support a loved one who has ovarian cancer. And I'm going to start these practical suggestions by talking about good communication, and good communication from the very beginning of a person's experience with cancer. On the support line, myself and Val hear frequently from women and their loved ones, and in the scenario that they're talking about, there's often a sense that a good old-fashioned, honest conversation could have spared both parties an awful lot of heartache. So communication should be a very simple thing. If we take a look at the slide that talks about the basic principles of communication, and if we talk about how these principles apply to the webinar that we're in right now, it's clear that I am the sender of a message that I wish to deliver to you. I send that message by using my voice, by verbal communication, hopefully, and I've not heard otherwise, you're all hearing my voice and are receiving that message that I'm delivering. Fingers crossed, and again, I'm very hopeful here, you're also understanding the meaning behind those words. And under normal circumstances, I'd be receiving some feedback from you on the message that I have delivered. So it all seems fairly simple, yes? Well, sadly, it's not. The difficulty with communication lies in the fact that many external factors that are related to me as the sender of the message, but also to you as a receiver of the message, can impact on that process of communication. So these external factors are things like our past experiences, our attitudes, our skills, but also our perceptions of the message that's being delivered. So these all interfere with how the message is sent, but also how it's received and interpreted. There are infinite possibilities of where things can go wrong with communication. And what we hear from women with ovarian cancer is that because of this possibility of things going wrong, communication can actually cause them many difficulties. So on the next slide, I've tried to summarize what women who call our support line and who we've cared for in the past tell us about communication. So women tell us that they're quite often surprised by people's responses to their diagnosis. So they may find that some of their bestest, closest friends suddenly become distant. They don't call anymore, they don't call round anymore, they suddenly just become very distant. The flip side of that is that people who they consider to be very casual acquaintances suddenly become constant visitors. They also tell us that some people don't know what to say to them, so they don't say anything at all. The diagnosis very much becomes the elephant in the room, if you like. Women with ovarian cancer tell us that people want to share good news and bad news stories about other people that they know with cancer and how it went for them. And some women tell us that they're even told that they're the lucky ones. They're lucky because they've got a diagnosis, which some people wait a long time for. They're lucky because they're being offered treatment. They're lucky because they're still alive. It could have been worse. And again, that can be very, very difficult for a woman who has a diagnosis. Women also tell us that other people's needs for information can be very different to their own. So what I mean by this is that what the woman wants to know about their diagnosis, treatment and prognosis might be very different from what their loved one wants to know about their diagnosis, treatment and prognosis. It may be that their loved ones want to know more than they do. It may well be that their loved ones want to know less about what they do. And this dichotomy and this disparity between what people want to know can cause problems. Women tell us that talking about cancer all the time can be exhausting, and it can also be unwanted. So it's really important to notice that women will differ in how much they want to talk about their diagnosis. They quite often tell us that they miss just talking about normal things. And this is something that we'll consider later in the presentation. Women also worry about talking to their family about how they really feel about their diagnosis. And the flip side of that is that they also worry that their family and friends are putting on a brave face. And again, this is all things that we will cover later in the presentation. So we've talked about what some of the communication challenges can be in terms of supporting your loved one. And now what I'd like to do is talk about ways that we can try and overcome those challenges. So the first thing to say is, please don't be afraid to talk to your loved one. We frequently hear that people are not sure what to say or are scared of saying something that will cause the person with cancer to become upset. What I would suggest, however, is that your loved one hasn't suddenly changed overnight. They are still the same person as what they were before they had their cancer diagnosis. You haven't changed either. You can still be yourself, and they'll be keen for you to be that way. Talk about normal things. It's okay to laugh together still. Treat the person with cancer the same way as you always would. I can remember one woman with ovarian cancer telling me that one of the most refreshing things that she heard was when a friend who had heard about her cancer diagnosis turned around to her and simply said, "Well, this is all really crappy, isn't it?" And actually she was so pleased to have such an authentic and honest response, and a response that she expected from that friend, because that's the way she always behaved. Make plans, continue to make those plans, continue to remind your loved one that there are fun times to be had. Build in some flexibility so they don't feel the pressure, but make those plans. And remember, it's always better to say, "I don't know what to say," rather than to just stop visiting or calling altogether. Seek permission and set boundaries. This is another really important conversation to have with your loved one. Find out when it's acceptable for you to talk to them about the cancer. How much do they want to talk about the cancer? Do you need a time limit for talking about the cancer? Again, some women find it really helpful to say 6 o'clock is worry time. The rest of the day, we don't talk about cancer in the house, but at 6 o'clock, we can all sit down, have a conversation about how we're all feeling, what's on our minds. At 7 o'clock, we go back to normality. And what that does really nicely is stops talk of cancer taking over the entire day. Ask your loved one, are they comfortable with direct questions? Are they comfortable with questions about their prognosis and their treatments? Are you allowed, as their loved one, to ask members of their healthcare team? Are you allowed to ask with them there? Are you allowed to ask when they're not there? And just establishing these things can really avoid those awkward situations where someone wants information that the other person doesn't necessarily. And also establish with them, who are they willing for you to share their information with? And the last point on this slide is about it being okay to admit your own emotional concerns. Let's be honest, the chances are your loved one will know you very well. They'll know that you're worried, anxious, sad, and that you're trying to convince them that you are perfectly okay. But that just won't work. Don't be afraid to admit that you are struggling with certain things. And it's always good if this admission can be followed up by letting them know how you are coping with your own emotions. So the conversation might go something like, "Yes, Mum, of course I'm worried about you and I'm feeling scared. It's only natural that I'd feel this way. But I do have my friend Sam. I can talk to her about my fears. And I've also joined an ovarian cancer community where I can talk to other people who find themselves in a similar situation." So your loved one will be reassured that you've taken those steps to look after yourself. Okay, so next we're going to move on to another slide looking at communication challenges. And I'm going to focus on what can be quite a difficult communication situation, which is the one where a loved one might start to speak about these distressing emotions that they're feeling. And the reason this situation can be really quite difficult is because, firstly, it can be very distressing for you to see your loved one upset. And secondly, because we often just don't know how to respond. We don't know what to say. And more importantly, we don't know what to do to make things better for our loved ones. So it's natural that when you see someone you care about distressed or upset, you're going to try your very hardest to make them feel better. And what I would say here is that whatever you say or do in that moment in time is very unlikely to make that person feel less worried, sad, or anxious. It's built into all of us to jump into that rescue mode and say things like, "Oh, try not to worry," or "I'm sure everything will be okay," or, you know, the classic, "Of course your cancer won't have come back." The difficulty lies in the fact that your loved one will have already been trying to convince themselves that everything will be okay for a long period of time, and they won't have had any success with that. And that's because they know deep down that they don't have the certainty at that point in time that everything will be okay. They don't believe their own brains, so equally they won't be convinced by your attempts to convince them either. The good thing is that you can still be supportive by using specific communication skills. So when someone expresses an emotional concern like being scared or anxious, a tool called reflecting back can be really useful. This could be by saying something like, "It sounds to me as though you're feeling really scared right now." And this works really well because it allows your loved one to correct you if you've misunderstood what they were trying to say. But it also allows your loved one to know that they've been heard. The second skill in terms of communication tools is something called empathic listening. So mostly women will tell us that they don't find it helpful, even when it's done with the best intentions, when loved ones or friends or acquaintances share stories about other people and their cancer diagnosis. Everyone is different. Everyone responds and copes differently. And quite often hearing about how well or superbly someone else has coped can make a woman feel inferior or like a failure. And it can also downplay the experience that they're having in that moment in time. So on to the next slide. So the last slide about overcoming the communication challenges is about not always expecting to have an answer or a solution to a concern that someone is expressing. It's really important when you're communicating with your loved one to try and listen, and listen without thinking about what you're going to say next. So pay attention to the person who's talking, listen to what they're saying, and don't feel like you need to be able to give them an answer or a solution. Quite often, just listening can be more than enough. And even if it does go quiet for a period of time, don't be afraid of that silence. Don't feel that you have to fill it by saying something. In my experience, silence is quite often followed by a meaningful and honest admission from the person that you're communicating with. So one example I've got of this type of scenario and how allowing a person to feel that they've been heard can be really important was a woman who told me that she would quite often say to her husband, "I'm in awful pain." And the husband would generally respond with, "Can I get you some of your morphine?" And she would say, "I've just taken it. It hasn't really worked." "Well, can I get you some paracetamol?" "No, they never work. They won't do any good." And his response to this was generally one of anger. So he would say something like, "Well, in that case, then I'm not sure how I can help you." And he would leave the room. And this was obviously very distressing for the woman, but equally, I would imagine it was quite distressing for the husband. The husband was probably responding in anger because he felt upset with himself. You know, he felt that he couldn't do anything to make his wife feel better. But actually, all the wife wanted from her husband was for him to say, "I can see you're in pain, and actually that must be awful for you. Will you let me know if there's anything I can do to help you out?" So that's how reflecting back and showing that you've heard can be a really useful tool to make the other person feel that they've been listened to and cared for. So moving on from communication, we're next going to look at the physical consequences of cancer and its treatment, and things that you can then do to support your loved one with those physical consequences. So I'm sure many of you will unfortunately be all too familiar with the physical consequences of ovarian cancer. What I would say is I've listed the main physical consequences here that a lot of women will experience. There will be some other ones outside of this slide, and not every woman will experience these problems either. So fatigue, that's that overwhelming tiredness, is very common. Women can have pain, they can have issues with their gastric system, so feel full more quickly, have a poor appetite, some nausea, some vomiting. They can also experience disturbed bowel function or bladder function. And it may be that they have some reduced mobility or a complication of chemotherapy known as peripheral neuropathy, which can be a tingling in their hands and toes. Because fatigue is one of the most common symptoms of ovarian cancer, and it's actually one which can persist long after treatment is finished. So in terms of fatigue, what is it? Well, fatigue is an overwhelming tiredness. And the way that fatigue differs from just simple tiredness is that it doesn't tend to be relieved when you take a nap or have some sleep or take some rest. For some women, it can be relatively mild, but for others, they can describe feeling drained, washed out. You know, they'll tell us that they feel like they're walking through treacle. So what can you do to help? Well, going back to my original slide, talk about it first. Ask your loved one, how severe is this fatigue? What impact is it having on you and the things that you can do, and how does that make you feel? Perhaps the most important question to ask is, what help are they willing to accept? So some women will quite gladly let you take over certain parts of their usual roles. They'll quite gladly let you have the cooking or the cleaning. But for other people, losing those roles can be really quite difficult. It can almost be another threat to their identity. And they would still rather do their roles, but then perhaps take a nap in the afternoon whilst you field the visitors or update friends on how things are going. So talk about what they're willing to accept help with. The next thing to consider is energy bank balance. So it can be useful if you enable your loved one to think about their own energy bank balance. The analogy that I'd like to use is that before your cancer diagnosis, your loved one was probably a bit like an energy millionaire, let's say. They could continue to use large quantities of energy from their bank balance, and the chances are they would still remain in the black and have ample energy remaining to take out of their accounts whenever they wanted to. But suddenly, with their diagnosis, they're no longer an energy millionaire, but they have a tight budget to spend. They aren't used to being careful with their energy because they've never needed to before, so they don't necessarily understand how best to spend it. And the chances are that they will get the consequences of overspending, so they'll end up in an energy debt, if you like. So many women tell us that they have a day where they feel great, they go on a massive spending spree with all their energy, but then find the next day is truly awful from a fatigue point of view. So they've put themselves in debt. In the midst of having treatment and being tired, women can't always see this situation for themselves. So what you can do is talk to your loved one about this idea of a bank balance and help them to do something called activity prioritization. So what activity prioritization is all about is considering the small amount of energy that your loved one has, and then helping them to prioritize the tasks that are most important to them. So activities generally tend to be categorized according to achievement activities, such as doing work, chores, or study, connection activities, such as being around friends, family, and community, or activities that you do for enjoyment, like a hobby or a sport or something like that. And what I would suggest is encouraging them to try and focus their attentions on the connection and enjoyment activities. So have the conversation with them. Is there a physical job or chore that they can give to you that will cost you very little energy, but that will allow them to perhaps go out and have coffee with a friend the next day? One example I've got is a young woman who I cared for who had school-aged children. And she told me that every afternoon the doorbell would go, there would be a well-meaning visitor there bearing perhaps food or gifts. And because she was programmed to be polite, she would let them in, then make them a cup of tea, and then spend the next hour or two trying to keep up with the conversation. And what she found was that by the time her children got home from school, she was wiped out, exhausted, needed to lie down, and this caused her to feel very guilty. By doing the activity prioritization activity with this woman, what she came to realize was that she needed to spend her energy on her children. So what she did was send a very polite text around all her friends saying, struggling with energy right now, please can you text or message before you plan a visit? And please don't be offended if I say no. This is just something that I have to do for me and my children. So it can be a really useful tool. On another note, you could consider helping with making adjustments to your loved one's environment. So things that will help them to stop spending non-essential energy. So for example, could you put a stool in the kitchen that they can perch on if they want to help with preparing their dinner? Can you move things around their home to save them having to walk around the whole house to gather the things that they need during the day? And while it might seem counterintuitive, exercise is actually a really good antidote to fatigue. Encouraging them to take a short walk, for example, perhaps asking them if you can keep them company when you go when they go out. All these things can really help. And also just to mention that at Target Ovarian Cancer, we do run a weekly online yoga session on a Wednesday afternoon, which is led by Claire, who is a qualified yoga instructor who has a vast experience of working with people with cancer. It's a really well attended and well loved session, and Claire's really good at tailoring the exercises to the ability of the people with whom she works. So I'd highly recommend this session for any of your loved ones who have ovarian cancer, and you can find out more information about that and how to sign up on our website. So if we look at supporting your loved one with the other physical symptoms, the really important point to bring home here is to use your loved one's main point of contact and health professionals early if they're running into difficulties. It's unlikely that you or your loved one will be an expert in symptom control, and that is what the healthcare professionals are there for. The key is to try and nip symptoms in the bud. The longer you let those symptoms go uncontrolled for, the harder it can be to get back on top of them. So women will often say, oh, well, it's just a bit of nausea. You know, I know the team are busy. I don't want to bother them. Please do. Please ring them, and ring them early to get that support. On the subject of medications, women with cancer can need to take an awful lot of tablets, particularly if they're on chemotherapy treatment. A really useful thing that you can do is to be your loved one's second pair of ears. Write things down for them, help them remember how to take the medications. And one last point on this slide, and I've drawn attention to the area of eating difficulties in particular, because it can be a real flashpoint and a real bone of contention in some families and relationships. Eating enough and taking enough food on board can be a really emotive subject for many people. And often if your loved one doesn't feel to be eating enough or getting enough nutrition, it can be really quite distressing for you as their loved one. And what you might try and do is to encourage and cajole them into eating more. But often this doesn't really work, because your loved one might start to feel that pressure, they then can start to feel some guilt, and then they become anxious about needing to eat food. And actually it can get into a very vicious cycle of worrying about eating, so therefore not eating. So what I would always suggest is take the heat out of the situation. You can ask them, what is it that's stopping you from eating? If it's nausea, you can help them with their medications. If they feel full quickly, you can perhaps serve them very small portions on a side plate so it doesn't feel overwhelming. You could also try simply telling your loved one that you'll not keep harassing them about food, but please do let you know if there's something that they really fancy to eat, and you'll make it for them. Of course, it's important to say that if the situation with their eating doesn't improve or worsens, then please do seek help with this. It may be that your loved one would benefit from the input of a dietitian. Okay. So how can you help your loved one with difficult emotions? Most people with a cancer diagnosis will experience some degree of anxiety, as we've already established. Anxiety is a physical and emotional response to a perceived threat that may or may not come true. When someone is feeling particularly anxious, it can be really difficult for them to find enough headspace to find a way out of that situation. And this is where you can be really helpful. So can you distract them? Can you put the brakes on those anxious feelings by distracting them? Can you chat about normal stuff? Go out for a walk with them. You can also help support your loved one with some deep breathing or some mindfulness or relaxation. And this is something that you can do together. There are many apps available via the NHS website that can help with this. The other technique that can assist someone in the throes of anxious thoughts can be helped by helping them to recognise when they're falling into something called negative thought traps. These are thoughts that are deeply ingrained in all of us, but we often aren't able to recognise when we're falling into them. So an example of a thought trap might be something called catastrophizing. So this is where someone assumes that the worst possible thing is going to happen in a situation. So for example, they might assume that their cancer has come back, and that if that cancer had come back, that they absolutely would not cope with this. The other thought trap is something called jumping to conclusions. And this is where people feel that they can either predict the future, so my cancer will definitely come back, or people feel that they can read other people's minds. So it must be bad news because the nurse never normally picks up the phone and phones me. So what can be helpful for you as their loved one is to help your loved one to understand their thought traps and to make them gently aware that they're falling into them. So you could, for example, say, well, you know, you never thought you would cope with being told you had cancer, but here we are, and you are coping with this. You're strong, and even if this thing that you are fearing did happen, we would cope with it, again, like we are doing now. Or perhaps in the second scenario, you could remind them that, you know, actually you can't read that nurse's mind. The only thing you know for certain is that the nurse phoned you. Everything else is your brain playing tricks on you and being unhelpful. Sadness, low mood and depression are also quite common emotional difficulties, and some sadness and low mood can be entirely normal. As we've talked about before, there can be grief for the life that they had before their diagnosis. Support your friend by using activities, planning activities, but also keep an eye on their mood. We would generally expect that their mood will improve with time. But if you feel that your loved one is stuck or that things are worsening, then it is time to seek some expert help. A phone call to the GP or a clinical nurse specialist will enable you to access specialist counselling service for people with cancer and their loved ones. So now it's time to talk about the end of treatment, so when treatment is complete. And this slide looks at how other people who don't have cancer perceive what completing treatment will feel like. So women with ovarian cancer are often told, yay, you finished treatment, it's time to celebrate, you're the lucky one, you've survived this. Now, come on, it's time to get back to normal. You should be so grateful. My friend's great aunt's sister's babysitter never even got any treatment. You know, these are the types of things that women hear. But actually, the reality for women with ovarian cancer about what end of treatment feels like is very, very different for a lot of women. So my phone rings frequently, and I'll have a woman on the end of the phone who's very distressed, saying something along the lines of, I must be a terrible person. I finished my treatment so many weeks ago, and I know I should be grateful, and I know that I should be feeling great, but actually I just don't. The truth is, everyone around me seems to think I should be happy that my life is back to normal, but life feels anything but normal. Quite often they feel lost, alone, and scared about the future. The utter relief from women when I tell them that this is actually a really common experience for a lot of women, and work through the reasons why they might be feeling the way they are is utterly tangible. You know, you can hear that almost sigh of relief on the other end of the phone. So what can you do to support your loved ones with this transition? Well, first of all, acknowledge to your loved one that the end of treatment can feel really strange, and that a lot of people will feel really quite lost and bewildered. Please don't expect your loved one to bounce back to normal life, either physically or emotional, because that recovery is going to take a period of time after treatment ends, and it can, you know, things like tiredness can persist for a long period of time after treatment. Also, don't expect that continuous positive attitude. Emotional recovery certainly isn't a straight and smooth road. There will be bumps, there will be U-turns, and that's entirely normal as well. It's also important to acknowledge that there will be new challenges ahead for both of you. So your loved one might start to think about things like returning to work, financial concerns may be an issue for you. And once treatment is finished, your loved one might start to think around issues in terms of relationships and intimacy and sexuality again, and that can be very difficult for a woman. They also might have fears about the future, and it's also important to remember that when chemotherapy finishes, some women will still be on maintenance therapies as well, so something like Avastin or one of the PARP inhibitors, and they can bring their own unique set of side effects as well. Do please encourage your loved one to engage with their health professional team still. I can honestly, hand on heart, say, having been a clinical nurse specialist, that they do still want to hear from you and they still do want to support you. Many women tell us they feel cast adrift at the end of treatment. They've gone from having really regular contact with their healthcare professionals, perhaps even on a weekly basis, to all of a sudden, go on out there and get on with life as normal. A lot of clinical nurse specialists will offer something called an end of treatment holistic needs assessment. And this can be a really good opportunity for a woman to discuss any ongoing needs and concerns that she has, and to allow the nurse specialist to signpost your loved one onto appropriate support services, such as benefits advice, psychology services, support groups and forums. If this is something that your loved one hasn't been offered, it might be worth asking if there's an opportunity for them to have one of these appointments and engage in proactive self-care. Taking care of yourself is really, really important. As it says on the slide, fit your own oxygen mask first. Look after yourself first, because if you don't, you won't be in the position to look after somebody else. Your loved one will be spending a lot of time worrying about you and the impact that their diagnosis has had on you. So do something, look after yourself so that you can reassure them that they can stop worrying about what this is doing to you. Fit your own oxygen mask first. I can't emphasize that enough. So what can you do to look after yourself? Well, you need to make sure that, I'm talking about bank accounts again, I'm a bit obsessed, but you need to make sure that your resilience bank account is as healthy as it possibly can be. So delegate. There are no medals at the end of this. It's not the Great North Run. You don't get a shiny medal at the end of it for your valiant attempts to do everything by yourself. Most people, when they hear about a person's cancer diagnosis, feel quite useless. They want to do something to make the person feel better. They want to do something to help. So let somebody else take on some of the roles and responsibilities, not just for your sake, but for their sake as well. Just to point out that Carers UK, the charity, have got a lovely little app. It's called Jointly, which if you Google it, you'll be able to find out about. And this can be really useful if you're caring from a distance. It allows you to set up tasks that need doing, and then for other people to allocate themselves to that particular task. Do make sure that you're prioritizing time for yourself and dedicating time for yourself to do the things that you enjoy. It's really important to keep in touch with your own social contacts. Many family and friends will tell us they feel guilty for carrying on with life as normal when their loved one is ill. But please do try and maintain that time for you. It's really important for your own health and well-being. And finding someone independent to talk to can also be really useful. We often hear from loved ones that the person they would normally go to if they were scared or upset is the person who actually has the cancer diagnosis, and this can make things feel really difficult. So sometimes it's about having someone independent to the situation who you can be really honest and open with about the ways that you're feeling. And we take a lot of calls on the support line from people who are in this situation. We speak to a lot of family and friends who just want to talk about how they're feeling, knowing that they won't upset anybody and that they can offload and share that way that they're feeling. So please do consider using us if you find yourself in that situation. In terms of other ideas about self-care, a cancer diagnosis can make people feel that they've lost a lot of their control. Sometimes loved ones will feel really angry. They might feel a sense of injustice, particularly if their loved one had a delayed or a prolonged diagnosis. So we hear from loved ones that becoming involved in things like fundraising activities or campaigning activities towards things like early diagnosis or new treatments for ovarian cancer can actually give them back some of that sense of control and address that injustice that they're feeling. And if this is something that's of interest to you, you can find out more about this from our website. It's also really important to try and engage in some specifically focused relaxation activities. These can help to counteract the effects of that chronic stress that we were talking about earlier. They can try and switch off that cortisol and that adrenaline, which can cause so many problems. So we've come to the end of our session. I'd like to thank you all so much for joining us. I really do hope that you enjoyed it, and we hope that you found the session useful. If you have any questions or concerns or would just like to have a chat, our support line is available Monday to Friday. If you'd like to talk to myself or Val, please do call us on 0207 923 5475. There's also a wealth of information on our website and within the ovarian cancer community. Thank you again so much for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. We look forward to seeing you and your loved ones at our future digital events. Thank you.